Hello, BookTube. It's time for Chapter 3 of A. Edward Newton's The Amenities of Book Collecting and Kindred Affections. I've tried to do this a few times. It's a longer chapter than the previous ones, and it takes approximately an hour and 5 to 8 minutes to read. But my device will only record to 57 minutes and a few seconds and then cuts off every time. So I can't do it all in one go. So I propose to do it in two parts, and this way I can actually then show a number of the illustrations that go along with the chapter. And the chapter is entitled Old Catalogues and New Prices. The true book lover is usually loath to destroy an old book catalogue. It would not be easy to give a reason for this, unless it is that no sooner that he has done so than he has occasion to refer to it. Such catalogues reach me by almost every mail, and I while away many hours in turning over their leaves. Anatole France, in his charming story The Crime of Sylvester Bonnard, makes his dear old book collector say, "There is no reading more easy, more fascinating, and more delightful than that of a catalogue." And it is so, for the most part. But some catalogues annoy me exceedingly. Those which contain long lists of books that are not books, genealogies, county, and especially town histories, illustrated with portraits, obsolete medical and scientific books, books on agriculture and disease of the horse. How it is that anyone can make a living by vending such merchandise is beyond me, but so are most things. Living, however, in the country and going to town every day, I spend much time on the trains and must have something to read beside newspapers. Who was it that said that reading newspapers is a nervous habit? And it is not always convenient to carry a book, so I usually have a few catalogues which I mark industriously, thus presenting a fine imitation of a busy man. One check means a book that I own, and I note with interest the prices. Another, a book that I would like to have, while yet another indicates a book to which under no circumstances would I have a place on my shelves. When my library calls for writing up, these slim pamphlets are not discarded as they should be, but are stored in a closet to be referred to when needed, until at last something must be done to make room for those that come today and those that will come tomorrow. On one of these occasional house clearings, I came across a bundle of old catalogues which I have never had it in me to destroy. One of them was published in 1886 by a man I knew well years ago, Charles Hutt, of Clement's Inn, Gateway, Strand. Hutt himself has long since passed away, so has his shop, the Gateway, and indeed the Strand itself. His part of it, that is. I sometimes think that the best part of old London has disappeared. Need I say that I refer to Holywell Street and the Clare Market district, which lay between the Strand and Lincoln's Inn Fields, which Dickens knew and described so well. Hutt in his day was a man of considerable importance. He was the first London bookseller to realize the direction and the value of American market. Had he lived, my friends Sabin and Spencer and Maggs would have a serious rival. All the odd catalogues before me are alike in one important respect, namely the uniform low prices. From the standpoint of today, the prices are absurdly low. Or are those of today absurdly high? I, for one, do not think so. When a man puts pen to paper on the subject of the price of rare books, he feels, at least I feel, that it is a silly thing to do, and yet we collectors have been doing it always, or almost always. To point out that prices have about reached the top notch, and that the wise man will wait for the inevitable decline before he separates himself from his money. Now it is my belief that books, in spite of the high prices that they are bringing in the shops and the auctions, have only just begun their advance, and that there is no limit to the prices they will bring as time goes on. The only way to guess the future is by study of the past. And such study as I have been able to make leads me to believe that for the really great books, the sky is the limit. The really great books, what are they, and where are they? I am not sure that I know that they do not often come my way, nor when they do am I in a position to compete for them. But as I can be perfectly happy without an ocean-going yacht, contenting myself with a motorboat, so I can make shift to get along without a Gutenberg Bible, without a first folio Shakespeare, or any of the quartos, in short, sans any of those books which no millionaire's library can be without. But this I will say, that if I could afford to buy them, I would pay any price for the privilege of owning them. A man may be possessed of relatively small means, and yet indulge himself in all the joys of collecting, if he will deny himself other things not so important to his happiness. It is a problem in selection, as Elia points out in his essay Old China. When weighing for and against and the wearing of old clothes as recommended by his sister Bridget, if the 12 or 16 shillings save is to enable one to bring home in triumph an old folio, as a book collector Lamb would not take high rank, but he was a true book lover, and the books he liked to read he liked to buy. And just here I may be permitted to record how I came across a little poem in the manuscript of the author which exactly voices his sentiments and mine. I was visiting Princeton not long ago, that beautiful city, which its lovely halls and towers, and interested in libraries I always am, had secured permission to browse at will among the collections formed by the late Lawrence Hutton. After an inspection of his portraits in plaster, a collection of death masks, unique in this country or elsewhere, I turned my attention to his association books. It is a difficult lot to classify, and not of overwhelming interest, not to be compared with Richard Wan Mere's collection of Cruikshank, which has just been bequeathed to the library. But nothing which is a book is entirely alien to me, and the Hutton books, with their inscriptions from their authors, testify to their regard for him and to his love of books, are well worth examination. I had opened many volumes at random, and finally chanced upon Brander Matthews' Ballads of Books, a little anthology of bookish poems, for many years a favorite of mine. Turning to the inscription I found, but what interested me particularly was a letter from an English admirer, one Thomas Hutchinson, enclosing some verses, of which I made a copy without the permission of anyone. I did not ask the librarian, for he might have referred the question to the trustees or something, but I did turn to the speaking likeness of Larry that hung right above the bookcase, and seemed to say, "Why, sure, fellow book lover, pass on the torch. Print anything you please." And these are the verses. The poem is entitled "Ballad of a Poor Book Lover." Though in its stern vagaries fate a poor book lover me decreed, perchance mine is a happy state. The books I buy I like to read. To my dear friends they are indeed. But however enviously I sigh, of others take I little heed. The books I read I like to buy. My depth of purse is not so great, nor yet my bibliophilic greed, that merely buying doth elate. The books I buy I like to read. Still I e'en when dawdling in amend, beneath a cloudless summer sky, by bank of Thames or Tyne or Tweed, the books I read I like to buy. Some books, though tooled in style ornate, yet worms upon their contents feed. Some men about their bindings prate, the books I buy I like to read. Yet some day may my fancy breed, my ruin I may now be nigh. They reap, we know, who sowed the seed. The books I read I like to buy. And it ends with a little stanza called Envy. Though frequently to stall I speed, the books I buy I like to read. Yet wealth to me will never high. The books I read I like to buy. Two things there are which go to make the price of a book. First, the book itself, its scarcity, together with the urgency of the demand for it. A book may be unique and yet practically valueless because the fact that no one much cares to have it. And second, the plentifulness of money, or the ease with which its owner may have acquired his fortune. No one will suppose that in the famous auction of London, something over 100 years ago, that Earl Spencer bid £2,250 for the famous Boccaccio, and the Marquis of Blandford added impertinently 10 to secure the prize. No one will suppose that either of the gentlemen had a scanty rent roll. In England, the days of the great private libraries are over. For generations, indeed, for centuries, the English have had the leisure, the inclination, and the means to gratify their tastes. They once searched the continent for books and works of art. Very much we now go to England for them. They formed their libraries when the books were plentiful and prices low. Moreover, there are fewer collectors than there are today. We are paying big prices. The English never sell except at a profit. But all things considered, we are not paying more for the books than they are worth. There are probably now in England as many collectors as there ever were, but nevertheless the books are coming to this country, and while we may never be able to rival the treasures of the British Museum and the Bodleian, outside the great public libraries, the important collectors are now in this country and will remain here. And I am not sure how much longer the London dealers are going to retain their preeminence. We hear of New York becoming the center of financial world. It will in time become the center of bookselling world as well, the best market in which to buy and in which to sell. With the possible exception of Quaritch, George D. Smith has probably sold as many rare books as any man in the world, while Dr. Rosenbach on the second floor of his shop in Philadelphia has a stock of rare books unequaled by any other dealer in this country. Ask any expert where the great books are, and you will be told, if you do not know already, of the wonders of Mr. Morgan's collections, of how Mr. Huntington has bought one library after another until he has practically everything obtainable by Mr. William K. Bixby's manuscripts, of Mr. White's collections of the Elizabethans, and of Mr. Folger's Shakespeare's. So I'll pause here to show you a picture of Huntington. There are as many tastes as there are collectors. Caxtons and incunabula of any sort are highly regarded. Even the possession of a set of Shakespeare's folios makes a man a marked man, in spite of the fact that Henrietta Bartlett says they are not rare. But then Bartlett has been browsing on books rarer still, namely the first quartos, of which there are of Hamlet 2 copies only. One in this country with the title page but lacking the last leaf, while the other copy in the British Museum has the last leaf but lacks the title page. And the Venus and Adonis of the first 8 editions, of which only 13 copies are known to exist. All of them are yet in England, except one copy of the second edition, which is owned by the Elizabethan Club of Yale University. Of Titus Andronicus, there is only one copy of the first printing, this in the library of H.C. Folger of New York. Surely no one will dispute Miss Bartlett's statement that the quartos are rare indeed. But why continue? Enough has been said. The point I want to make is that 50 years from now, someone will be regretting that he is not present when a faultless first folio could have been had for the trifling sum of $25,000, at which figure a dealer is now offering one. Our glancing over a copy of the book prices current for 1918 bewail the time when presentation copies of Dickens could have been had for a trifling sum of $1,000. Hush, I feel spirit of prophecy upon me. I say that I sat with Henry Widener at Anderson's auction rooms a few years ago on the evening when George D. Smith, acting for Mr. Huntington, paid $50,000 for a copy of the Gutenberg Bible. No book had ever sold for so great a price, yet I feel sure that Mr. Huntington secured a bargain. And I told him so, but for the average collector, such great books as these are mere names, as far above the ordinary man as the moon, and the wise among us never cry for them. We content ourselves with something else. In collecting, as in with everything else, experience is the best teacher. Before we can gain our footing, we must make our mistakes and have them pointed out to us, or by reading discover them for ourselves. I have a confession to make. 40 years ago, I thought that I had the makings of a numismatist in me, and was for a time diligent in collecting coins. In order that they might be readily fastened to a panel covered with velvet, I pierced each one with a small hole, and was such chagrined when I was told that I had absolutely ruined the lot, which was worth perhaps $10. This was not a high price to pay for my discovery. I then made and noted that it is a height of wisdom to leave alone anything of value which may come my way, to repair, inlay, insert, mount, frame, or bind as little as possible. This is not to suggest that my library is entirely devoid of books and bindings. A few specimens of the good binders I have, but what I value most is a sound bit of straight grained crimson morocco covering the poems of Mr. Gray, with one of the finest examples of foredge painting they have ever seen, representing the Stoke Pogues churchyard, the scene of the immortal elegy. And there is a photo of the foredge painting, which is quite exquisite. I was start this again. I was much pleased when I discovered that this binding bore the stamp of Taylor and Hesse, a name I had always associated with first editions of Charles Lamb. How many people have clipped signatures from old letters and documents under the mistaken notion that they were collecting autographs? I happen to own the receipt of the copyright of the Essays of Elia. It was signed by Lamb twice. Originally, one signature has been cut away. It is a precious possession as it is, but I could wish that the collector, in whose hands it once was, had not removed one signature for a scrapbook properly so called. Nor is the race yet dead of those who, indulging a vicarious taste for subscription books, think that they are forming a library. My coins I have kept ever present reminder of the mistake of my early days. Luckily, I escaped the subscription book stage. What we collect depends as well upon our tastes as upon our means. Far given zeal and intelligence, it is surprising how soon one acquires a collection of whatever it may be, which becomes a source of relaxation and instruction, and after a little one becomes, if not exactly expert, at least wise enough to escape obvious pitfalls. When experience directs our efforts, the chief danger is past. But how much there is to know. I never leave the company of a man like Dr. Rosenbach or A.J. Bowden or the late Luther Livingston without feeling a sense of hopelessness coming over me. What wonderful memories these men have! How many minute points about books they must have indexed, so to speak, in their minds. And there are collectors whose knowledge is equally bewildering. Mr. White or Mr. Beverly Chew, or, for example, the Harry Widener, who, had he lived, would have set a new and, I fear, hopeless standard for us all. Not knowing much myself, I have found it wise not to try to beat the expert. It is like trying to beat Wall Street. It cannot be done. How can an outsider with the corner of his mind compete with the one who is playing the game ever and always? The answer is simply he can't, and he will do well not to try. It is better to confess ignorance and rely upon the word of a reliable dealer than to endeavor to put one over on him. This method may enable a novice to buy a good horse, although such has not been my experience. I think it was Trollope who remarked that not even a bishop could sell a horse without forgetting he is a bishop. I think I would rather trust a bookseller than a bishop. And speaking of booksellers, they should be regarded as Hamlet did his players, as the abstract and brief chronicles of the time, and it would be well to remember that their ill report of you while you live is much worse than a bad epitaph after you're dead. Their stock in trade consists not only in the books they have for sale, but in their knowledge. This may be at your disposal if you use after your own honor and dignity. But to live, they must sell books at a profit, and the delightful talk about books which you as so much enjoy must at least occasionally result in a sale. Go to them for information as a possible customer, and you will find them, as Dr. Johnson said, generous and liberal minded men, but use them solely as walking encyclopedias, and you may come to grief. I have on the shelves over yonder a set of Fox's Martyrs in 3 ponderous volumes, which I seldom have occasion to refer to, but in one volume is pasted a clipping from an old newspaper telling a story of the elder Quaritch. A young lady once entered his shop in Piccadilly and requested to see the great man. She wanted to know all that was known of this once famous book, all about editions and prices and points, of which there are many. Finally, after he had answered questions readily enough for some time, the old man became wise and remarked, "Now, my dear, if you want to know anything else about this book, my fee will be 5 guineas." The transaction was at an end. Had Quaritch been a lawyer and the young lady a stranger, her first question would have resulted in the request for a retainer. But I am a long time in coming to my old catalogues. Let me take one at random and, opening it at the first page, pick out the first item which meets my eye. Here it is. Alkin Henry, Analysis of the Hunting Field, Woodcuts and Colored Illustrations. First edition, Royal, 8VO, original cloth uncut, Ackerman, 1846, £2. It was the last work but one of a man who is now collected by many who, like myself, would as soon think of riding a zebra as a hunter. My copy cost me £100, while my Life of Mitten, 3rd edition, I regard as a bargain at 50. Had I been wise enough to buy it 35 years ago, I would have paid about as many shillings for it. With sporting books in mind, it is quite natural to turn to Surtees. His Jorrocks, Jaunts, and Jollities is missing from the catalogue, but here are a lot of them. Mr. Sponge's Sporting Tour in full Levant Morocco extra by Tout for 3 guineas, and Ask Mama in cloth uncut for £2 15 shillings. Hadley Cross is priced at 15 shillings, and Fancy Romford's Hounds at £2. All first editions, mind you, and for the most part just as you want them in the original cloth uncut. My advice would be to forget those prices of yesteryear, and if you want the set of the best sporting novels ever written, I know a charming woman who has read every one of them, go at once to them and sell. But while we are thinking of a colored plate books, let us see what it would have cost us to secure a copy of A. Beckett's Comic History of Rome. Here it is, complete in numbers as originally published. 4 guineas, while A Comic History of England, 2 volumes, bound by Reverie from the original parts, in full red Levant Morocco extra, for a cost 5 guineas. I have tried to read these histories. It cannot be done. It is like reading that not very funny book of old-time comic operas, always excepting Gilbert's, which depended for its success on the music and the acting, as these books depend on their illustrations by Leach. It is on account of the humor of their wonderful caricatured portraits of historic personages in anachronistic, put my tongue in better, in anachronistic surroundings, and these books live and deserve to live. What could be better than the landing of Julius Caesar at the shores of Albion from the deck of a Channel steamer of Leach's own time? Did you observe that the history of Rome was bound up in original parts? This, according to modern notions, is a mistake. Parts should be left alone, severely alone, I should say. I have no love for books in parts, and as this is admitted heresy, I should perhaps explain. As it is well known, some of the most desired of my modern books, Pickwick and Vanity Fair, for example, were so published, and particulars as to one will indicate the reason for my prejudice against all books in parts. In April 1916 in New York, the Coggeshall Dickens collection was dispersed, and a copy of Pickwick in parts was advertised, no doubt correctly, as the most nearly perfect copy ever offered to the public sale. Two full pages of the catalogue were taken up in painstaking description of the birthmarks of this famous book. It was, like most of the other great novels, brought out 20 parts in 19. That is, the last number was a double number. And with a page of the original manuscript, it brought $5,350. When a novel published less than a century ago brings such a price, it must be extraordinary interest and rarity. Was the price high? Decidedly not. There are said to be not 10 such copies in existence. It was in superb condition, and manuscript pages of Pickwick do not grow on trees. All the details which go to make up a perfect set can be found in Eccles' first edition of Charles Dickens. Briefly, in order to take high rank, it is necessary that each part should be clean and perfect, and should have the correct imprint and date. It should have the proper number of illustrations by the right artist, and these plates must be original and not re-etched. And almost every plate has certain peculiarities which will mislead the unwary. But this is not all. Each part carried certain announcements and advertisements. These must be carefully looked to, for they are of the utmost value in determining whether it be an earlier or later issue of the first edition. An advertisement of Rowland and Sons toilet preparations, where Simpson's pills should be, might lead to painful discussion. But it is difficult to say whether the possession of a copy of Pickwick, like the Colgeshall copy, is an asset or a liability. It must be handled with gloves. The pea green paper wrappers are very tender, and not everyone who insists on seeing your treasures knows how to treat such a pamphlet. And horror of horrors, a part may get stacked up in a pile of outlooks on the library table, or get mislaid altogether. So, on the whole, I am inclined to leave such books to those whose knowledge of bibliography is more exact than mine, and who would not regard the loss of a part as an irretrievable disaster. My preference is to get, when I can, books bound in cloth or boards as issued. They are sufficiently expensive and can be handled with greater freedom. My library is, in a sense, a circulating library. My books move around with me, and a bound book, in some measure at least, takes care of itself. Having said all of which, I looked upon that Coggeshall Pickwick and lusted after it. There is, however, an even greater copy awaiting a purchaser at Rosenbach's. It is a presentation copy in parts, the only one known to exist. Each of the first 14 parts has Dickens' autographed inscription. Mary Hogarth from hers most affectionately. Variously signed in full, Charles Dickens with initials or the editor. After the publication of the 14th part, Miss Hogarth, his sister-in-law, a young girl in the 18th year, died suddenly, and the shock of her death was so great that Dickens was obliged to discontinue work upon Pickwick for 2 months. No doubt this is the finest Pickwick in the world. It has all the points and to spare, and the price, well, only a very rich or a very wise man could buy it. But return to my catalogue. Here is Pierce Egan's Boxania, 5 volumes, 8 VO, as clean as new, in the original boards uncut. That's my style. And the price, £12, $350 would be a fair price today. And here is the antecedents of the life of transactions of Mrs. Margaret Rudd, a notorious woman who just escaped hanging for forgery, of whom Dr. Johnson once said that he would have gone to see her, but that he was prevented from such a frolic by his fear that it would get into the newspapers. I have been looking for it in vain for years. Here it is in new calf price, 9 shillings, and Stern's Sentimental Journey, first edition, a contemporary calf, for 30. Let us turn to poetry. Arnold Matthew, not the interesting Nothing It Chances by Blake, his poetical sketches, 1783, has always been excessively rare. Only a dozen or so copies are known, and Songs of the Innocents and Experience, while not so scarce, is much more desired. This lovely book was originally Songs of Innocence only, came later Experience came later, as it always does. Of all the books I know, this is the most interesting. It is in it is in very deed W. Blake, his book, the author being as well the designer, engraver, printer, and illuminator of it. And here is title page in black and white, though, sadly. To attempt in a paragraph any bibliographical account of the songs is as impossible as to give the genealogy of a fairy. In the ordinary sense of the book, in the ordinary sense, the book was never published. Blake sold it to such of his friends as who would buy, at prices ranging from 30 shillings to 2 guineas. Later, to help him over a difficulty, and his life was full of difficulties, they paid him perhaps as much as £20, and in return got a copy glowing with colours and gold. Hence, no two copies were exactly alike. It is one of the few books of which a man fortunate enough to own any copy may say, I like mine best. And the price today for an average copy is about $2,000. I can see clearly now that in order to be up to date, there must be a new edition of this book every minute. I had just suggested $2,000 at a probable price for of the songs when a price copy of the Lino catalog of his Blake collection reached me. This, the last and greatest Blake collection in England, was sold at auction on March 15, 1918, and accustomed as I am to high prices, I was bewildered as I turned its pages. There were two copies of the songs, each brought £735. The Poetical Sketches was conspicuous by its absence, while The Marriage of Heaven and Hell was knocked down for £756. The drawings for Dante's Divine Commedia, 68 in all, brought the amazing price of £7,665, and these prices will be materially advanced before the booksellers are done, and with them, and we shall see when their catalogues arrive. We come back to earth only with a thud after this lofty flight, in the course of which we seem to have been seeing visions and dreaming dreams such as Blake himself did. Continuing to beat the track of the alphabet, we reach Bronte and note that now a scarce item, poems by Curry, Ellis, and Action Bell, the genuine first edition printed by Hassler in 1846 for Eilert and Jones, before the title page bore the Smith Elder imprint, priced £2.05. Walter Hill's last catalogue has a Smith Elder copy at $12.50, but the Wright imprint now makes a difference of several $100s. About a year ago, Edmund D. Brooks of Minneapolis was offering Charlotte Bronte's own copy of the book with the Eilert and Jones imprint, with some manuscript notes which made it especially interesting to Bronte collectors, the most important of whom, by the way, is my lifelong friend H. H. Bonnell of Philadelphia, whose unrivaled Bronte collection is not unworthy of an honored place in the Bronte Museum at Haworth. I called his attention to it, but he already had a presentation copy to Ebenezer Elliott, the corn law rhymer. Burns, the first Edinburgh edition for a song, no Kilmark edition. That fine old item which every collector wants has always been excessively scarce, and in this connection let me disenter a good story of how one collector secured a copy. The story is told of John Allen, from whom, as a collector, I am descended by the process of clasping hands. My old friend Ferdinand Dreer, for more than 60 years a distinguished collector in Philadelphia, was an intimate friend of Allen's, and passed on to me the collecting legends he had received about him. Allen was an old Scotchman living in New York when the story begins, who by his industry had acquired a small fortune, much of which he spent on the purchase of books. He collected the books of his period and extra illustrated them. Lives of Mary Queen of Scots and Byron, Dibdin, of course, and the Americana, but Burns was his ruling passion. He had the first Edinburgh edition and longed for the Kilmarnock, uh, as who does not. He had a standing order for a copy by up to 7 guineas, which in those days was considered a fair price, and finally one was reported to him from London at 8. He ordered it out, but it was sold before his letter arrived, and he was greatly disappointed. Some time afterward, a friend from an old country visited him, and from the old country had visited him, and as he was sailing, asked if he could do anything for him at home. Yes, said Alan, get me, if you possibly can, the Kilmarnock edition of Burns. His friend was instructed as to its scarcity and to the price he might have to pay for it. On his return, his friend, engaged as usual in his affairs, discovered that one of the workmen was drunk, in whose days it was not considered good form to get drunk except on Saturday night. How could he get drunk in the middle of the week? Where did he get the money? The answer was that by pawning some books, 10 shillings had been raised. And what books had you? Oh, Burns and some others. Every Scotchman has a copy of Burns. Then suddenly, remembering his old friend in New York, he asked what sort of copy was it. The old Kilmarnock, was his reply. Not to make a story too long, the pawn ticket was secured for a guinea, and the books redeemed, and the Kilmarnock Burns passed into Alan's possession. After his death, his books were sold at auction 1864. This was during our Civil War, and several times the sale was suspended, owing to the noise of the passing regiment in the street. Notwithstanding that times were not propitious for book sales, his friends were astonished at the prices realized. The Burns fetched $106. It was probably a poor copy. A generation or two ago, not as much care as was paid on condition as now. Very few uncut copies are known. One is owned by a man as shouldn't. Another is in the Burns Museum in Ayrshire and cost the museum trustees £1,000. The Canfield, which was purchased by Henry Widener for $6,000, and the Van Antwerp copy, which at the sale of his collection in London in 1907 brought £700. But much bibliographical water has gone over the dam since 1907, and for some reason the Van Antwerp books, with the exception of one or two items, did not bring as good prices as they should have done. They were sold at an unfortunate moment, and perhaps at the wrong place. In Walter Hill's current catalogue, there is a Kilmarnock Burns in an old binding, which looks very cheap to me at $2,600. At the Allen sale, an Eliot Bible brought the then enormous sum of $825. Supposing an Eliot Bible were obtained today, it would bring, no doubt, $5,000, perhaps more. This is a long digression. There are desired volumes beside Burns. Here is a Paradise Lost, perhaps not so fine a copy as Sabin is now offering for £400, but the price is only £30, and this reminds me that in Beverly Chew's copy, an exceptionally fine one, as all the books of that fastidious collector are, there is an interesting note made by the former owner to this effect. This is the first edition of the book that has the first title page. It is worth nearly £10 and is rising in value, 1857. Alphabetically speaking, it is only a step from Milton to Moore, George. Here is his Flowers of Passion, for which I paid $15 10 or more years ago, priced at half-a-crown. But let us take up another catalogue, one which issued from the world-famous shop in Piccadilly, Quaritch's. 40 years ago, Quaritch thought it almost beneath his dignity as a bookseller to offer for sale anything except the very rarest books in English. Very much as up to within the last few years, the universities of Oxford and Cambridge did not think it worth their while to refer more than occasionally to the glories of English literature. When we open an old Quaritch catalogue, we step out of this age into another, which lends me to observe how remarkable is the change in taste which has come over the collecting world in the last 50 years. Formerly, it was the fashion to collect extensively books of which few among us now know anything, books in learned or painful languages on philosophy and religion, as well as those which, for the want of a better name, we call classics, books frequently spoken of but seldom read. Such books, unless very valuable indeed, no longer find ready buyers. We have come into our great inheritance. We now dip deep into our well of English undefiled. Aldines and Elzevers have gone out of fashion. Even one of the rarest of them, La Pasteur Francois, is not greatly desired, and I take it that the reason for this change is chiefly due to the difference of the type of men who are prominent among the buyers of fine books today. Formerly, the collector was a man not necessarily with a liberal education, but with an education entirely different from that which the best educated among us now receive. I doubt if there are in the country today half a dozen important book buyers who can read Latin with ease, let alone Greek. Of French, German, and Italian, some of us have a working knowledge, but most of us prefer to buy books that which we can enjoy without uh, without constant reference to a dictionary. The world is the college of the book collector of today. Many of us are busy men of affairs, familiar it may be with the price of oil or steel or copper or coal or cotton, or it may be with the price of the shares of all these and more. Books are our relaxation. We make it a rule not to buy what we cannot read. Some of us indulge in the vain hope that time will bring us leisure to acquaint ourselves fully with the contents of all our books. We want books written in our own tongue, and most of us have some pet author or group of authors or period, it may be, in which we love to lose ourselves and forget the cares of the present. One man may have a collection of Pope, another of Goldsmith, another of Lamb, and so on. The drama has its votaries who are never even in a theater, but look into the library in their libraries, and you will find everything from Ralph Royster Doyster to the importance of being earnest. And note that these collections are formed by men who are not students in the accepted sense of the word, but who, in the course of years, have accumulated an immense amount of learning. Clarence S. Bement is a fine example of the collector of today, a man of large affairs with the taste of learning of a scholar. It has always seemed to me that professors of literature and collectors do not intermingle as they should. They might learn much from each other. I yield to no professor in my passion for English literature. My knowledge is deficient and inexact, but what I lack in learning, I make up in love. And I will end it there, and we'll finish the rest in part two. So I'll see you in a bit, book two.